I don't want this to devolve solely into a discussion of margin, so I want to return to the question of Edison. So my understanding is that there are major questions about the quality and completeness of the data in the NIH Edison system. And I assume that your assumption of responsibility for it in NIST means those questions will be improved, if not resolved. But if that's the case, then my question is, who will have access to it? Will agencies have access to other agencies' data? Will researchers like Bhavin and his colleagues conceivably have access to Edison data on arrangements to ensure confidentiality?
It's a very good question. We are working on those kinds of issues at the interagency level. So there is an interagency work group solely for Bayh-Dole purposes. There is a lot of sensitivity within each agency about what information they make available, even at the interagency level. And so obviously there could be sensitivity around accidentally releasing business or proprietary information to the public, or worries. There are lots of worries. Of course, we would like to come up with consistent practices so that whatever data can be made available, obviously we would want to make it available, because I think the research that we saw from the earlier session, showed that there's a lot of benefits to analyzing that information. I know within my own economist teams at NIST, they would love to see interagency data. So both from the iEdison perspective as well as the intramural reporting systems, those are things that the interagency working groups will work toward and consider.
And I hope the economic community will weigh into those deliberations.
Yes, well, the iEdison redesign, there will be a request for information that goes live on that, and we hope that the public will weigh in and give all feedback, all possible feedback. It really does. Everything gets read, and everything does impact what we, in the end, do.
Okay. I have one final question, and then we'll turn it over to the audience. That goes back to the subject of patent subject matter eligibility. And the question is, you, Artie, and you, Jay, have both cautiously endorsed some sort of legislative action. Am I correct in that?
Well, I don't know that I've endorsed it. I don't endorse any of the things I've seen so far.
Right.
It's potentially possible that
Okay.
that something along the lines of. So my approach is, if people are interested, is not dissimilar from that taken by Judge Dyke in his concurrence in the denial of rehearing in Ariosa versus Sequinum. And it's a complex approach that I'm not sure Congress even has on its radar screen right now.
Okay.
So I'm not sure, and that's why I responded to Jay relatively sharply by saying that I was concerned that Congress was not looking at this in the most sophisticated manner.
Well, I understand that caveat. My question has to do with a very distinguished group of some 60-odd academicians, members of the Academy, who have told Congress in pretty no uncertain terms, don't legislate, because of concerns that any expansion of patenting would interfere with the conduct of fundamental non-commercial research. Do you share that concern? And if so, is a legislative research exemption from patent liability a possible way of addressing that set of concerns?
Sure. So a couple of questions there. If you've been active in the patent space outside the life sciences, you know that 10, 15 years ago, there were business method patents. And the BlackBerry, remember the once fabulously popular BlackBerry device that almost got wrested from our hands because a patent troll from Annandale, Virginia, sued the Canadian manufacturer? Well, that led ultimately to the Supreme Court acting against these kind of abstract idea patents. And it's unfortunate, in my view, that the Supreme Court then took the next step and equated natural laws to abstract ideas. So that to me was the big misstep, and that's something I think legislation could correct. And I agree, I'm not utterly enamored with approaches that I've seen. I'd rather see something that resembles the European Patent Convention outlined with the Biotechnology Directive, which allows much more liberal patenting of life sciences, which I think is appropriate, but then has a carve-out here and there. Okay, for example, for sort of spent genetic materials and things of that sort. To me, that's the most rational approach on the planet. It has its flaws as well. In terms of a research exemption, we've got one already. It's 271E1 of the Patent Act, the BOLAR exemption. And yeah, sure, we could readily expand it. That's not a hefty feat of legislative drafting. But I fear those concerns are overstated. Yeah, we've got the Myriad case and we have Mady v. Duke, but how many more of them do we really have?
Jay, I have to disagree with your characterization of, and I'm blanking on the guy who sued BlackBerry, but he had invented the first mobile email system, and it had been unsuccessful, and all he had left was the patents, and he offered BlackBerry a license, and they said, see you in court, and later came to regret that decision. I don't think that's any different from Facebook wasn't the first social platform. Friendster was. And Friendster got the fundamental patents, and when Facebook drove Friendster out of business, Facebook bought Friendster's patents for something like 10 times the going rate for bulk purchase of patents. So the pioneers often get broad patents that, if they're unsuccessful, that's their remaining asset. I go on and say that I don't think I've ever seen researchers inhibited from research by the presence of patents. And yes, we have 271E, but you have another much greater thing. It's incredibly expensive to sue somebody for patent infringement, and you ain't going to do it over research. You know, it's only when there's a major product in the market that there's enough money to be worth fighting over that people are going to sue. And I have never, ever seen a researcher inhibited from research by the presence of a patent.
Well, Ashley, as you know, the issue has really come up in those cases where there is money and research mixed together, in some ways somewhat inextricably, clinical diagnostics. So that's why the Myriad case arose. Now, Myriad is a bit of an outlier, I think, in all respects, and I take it that it's not a member of BIO, so it's considered an outlier by the community. That said, whenever there's a mixture of research and clinical work, there might be a problem because there is money to be made. Now, but the problem cuts both ways. What do you do? And this is to respond to your question, Steve. What does a research exemption do when it's research, but they're also making some money? You know, that gets difficult, particularly if, and this is where, so Steve will know this very well because this was, I don't know how many years of a project for the National Academies. What do you do when the research ultimately yields a pot at the end of the rainbow, a pot of gold at the end of the rainbow? Do you get reach-through rights to that research? Ultimately, reach-through rights to the products of the research? So that's the challenge. I generally think either way, even if we did have a research exemption, it would not end up being so problematic. But the fact that we don't is not so problematic either.
All right. This has been a great discussion, but we have a full half hour for you to chime in and ask questions. Yes.
Do you want to use the mic or?
Yes.
So I have a comment followed by a question. You know, we're on drug development, so I'm not going to talk about things beyond that. And many times also have response to, or an element of importance to all this debate about, well, how many of these patents came from NIH and how many have Martian rights? And the answer is, for most of them, the Martian rights of the stuff that was the early work, but the actual molecule was beyond a couple years later. Right? And the NIH was not directly involved. And so, if so, is there a disconnect in our data? Is there, just knowing what happens in drug development, does it change some of the things that we've talked about thus far today?
So I'm going to disagree a little bit with the premise that in general you wait until you're in clinical trials before you file a patent application.
I said at the end of lead up.
Oh, lead up. Okay. Right before pre-con. Okay. Yeah. So, so I totally agree with the principle that that yes, that's why Myriad hasn't had an impact on drug patents, because you can tweak it a bit and that's enough to get you past the PTO certainly, and probably will hold up in court as well. So that I agree with. I suppose that the question about the data is probably more directed towards folks like Bhavin and Daniel. Are they looking directly at the right patents? Is that what you're asking for or asking about?
I mean, their data may be on the earlier patent, which has an organic link, but not a natural thing that you can draw a line between. Same thing with the Martian rights. The Martian rights don't apply to the actual molecular patent. It happened in the years.
Well, so Bhavin can speak to that point more directly than I don't know.
Do you want to go to a mic or get a mic?
While he's getting there, I'll say that my research shows that there is absolutely not one size fits all and not one pathway from the lab to the marketplace. The pathways are all incredibly different, incredibly convoluted. The intellectual property from UC Berkeley underlying Yervoy, the first checkpoint inhibitor to reach the market, went through the hands of 9 companies, taking 16 years before it finally popped out. Its first 4 applications were as adjuncts to other actors before they finally, Bristol Myers finally went back to Jim Allison's original vision of monoclonal antibody monotherapy to treat cancer. So the pathways are so complex.
Certainly nothing that I've done is. I mean, I'm not that interested in Martian per se. Let's put it that way. So that's not the kind of purpose of what I was what I was after, at least. Let me ask if I may, Steve, just make a quick comment and then ask a question. The comment to my friend Ashley is on the idea that I'm certainly no expert in reading legislative history, but my recollection from histories of Bayh-Dole is that not only Marchin, but also recoupment, the limits on exclusive licensing, there was also some kind of, so recoupment was in there. It was important to bring around the old liberals who, since the discussion about the Kennedy Memorandum and the Nixon Memorandum, had been reluctant to give exclusive licenses to taxpayer-funded research. So Senator Nelson, Hyman Rickover, and others, that in the hearings, it's we're doing all this stuff to protect the public interest. That's who knows. The question is this: I think in some sense Marchin has a lot of baggage, and there's sort of an angels on the head of the pin aspect to this. I wonder if instead, I think Professor Thomas raised it. Early on there was something like a 5-year limit on exclusive licenses or something like that. What about something like that, like an X-year limit on exclusive licenses? And then, could that have any impact? What would X be, and how would you know?
So there was the 5-year limit in the original Bayh-Dole. My supposition is that that came from the American Cancer Society, which I think when I started looking at this, which was 10 years after Bayh-Dole, still had a 5-year limit. That might have been where that came from, but in Stevens-Weisler in '84, they very quickly removed that. The question is, if a drug takes 10 or 15 years, 16 in the case of Yervoy, to get to the marketplace, 5 years exclusivity ain't going to do much for you.
It's a little bit like patents. We're kind of stuck with a uniform patent term in general, right? But it's not clear to me that we're stuck with a uniform term of exclusivity for university licenses, and maybe we want to meter that to the extent of additional R&D investment required to get those drugs commercialized, and that's a knowable thing with the right kinds of data from Edison and other places.
Yep. It's very easy to have 20/20 hindsight, to say that patent didn't need to be exclusively licensed, etc. You have to look at it from the context of an academic tech transfer officer who's got an invention disclosure. As I said, it's 4 years till they're licensed. And some licensee comes along and trying to look into the future and see how it's going to play out. You can't do it. So, yeah, if we could go back with 20/20 hindsight, we might do some things differently. But you don't have to do that. You're doing it with limited information on the markets, on the technology, and you got to do the best you can and make sure that you put no barriers to the technology getting into the hands of the public ultimately.
Yeah, and I'll pipe in quickly that we do have some tailoring of intellectual property terms, again, through the intellectual property right that we're not talking about very much, but we ought to be, which are the FDA-administered regulatory exclusivities, where you'll get a 5-year new molecular entity exclusivity, then you'll get multiple 3-year clinical investigation exclusivities. You'll tack 6 months pediatric onto that. You'll get new formulations. You'll get new chemical cousins. You'll have over-the-counter, if you can do it at the end, to preclude. So there are sort of different tailorings and possibilities along those lines.
And of course, and I'm not going to make a statement one way or the other as to whether I favor those, but the challenge is, of course, the more you tailor, the more potential for gaming. That's a very standard lawyer move, as you know.
I mean, a lot of big company licenses from biotech have a term, a royalty term, not last to expire patent on a country-by-country basis, but the longer of the last to expire patent on a country-by-country basis, or X, where X is typically 10 years from first commercial sale. And I frankly advocate universities using that term because in the case of Yervoy, Berkeley got 4 years of royalties and a pretty miserable monetization for a very important drug compared with what UCLA got for Xtandi.
So I want to get back to that idea that you're talking about where universities are benefiting from actually having more stringent regulations on their IP that's coming out and actually making it more difficult for IP to come out of those universities. So in my experience, every university, but you can say like what is a university's tech transfer policy? It's different at every single university you go to. And some pharmaceutical companies will avoid certain universities that tech is coming out of because of the difficulty in transversing those deals. So what's interesting is if you look at some of the data coming out of the universities that produce the most innovative patents or spin-outs, maybe the IP that they're getting maybe 1% back of their entire fundraising capital that they get for that year. For the universities that are really, really strict on IP, that really dig down hard for that, it's 2%. We're talking about 1% of an entire university's fundraising for the entire year. Do you think that it's worthwhile to streamline the process at all universities? Should that be something that's federally mandated? Should it be something that, should be loosened? Or how do you explain those kinds of differences? And then what do we do to help that process along?
May I? As a practitioner, who I've worked at the universities as well, right? I'm going to very strongly push against that suggestion. I think that individual institutions ought to have the ability to set their own policies, right? So public institutions are not only governed by federal law but state law, right? Private institutions have their own boards and minders that have influence. And I understand the perspective of potential licensees and their frustrations at the fact that rules, policies, procedures are different everywhere, right? And it can be frustrating. I understand that. But at the same time, it's, you know, I hope I'm not wading into really bad waters here, but it's kind of like when we're worrying about price control, right? We're saying that we want to minimize our involvement in anything that's viewed as anti-competitive. And so when you're talking about licensing deals, terms of an agreement, to set some sort of bright line of this is what we all have to do, it kind of goes against, I think, the operational setup, right? So I can see your frustration. I'd say that universities that don't want to do deals, they're not going to do deals, right? Some universities or federal institutions have very business-friendly terms. You know, that's just the nature of the marketplace. I'd say that variability is the cost of doing business.
To be clear, I'm not advocating for a blanket statement. I'm asking what you guys think.
Oh, okay.
So
all right. Okay.
So there has been a controlled experiment on that. The Kaufman Foundation, which, as I said, was very active in this space 10 years ago, went to UNC Chapel Hill and gave them some funding. And they came up with what was termed an express license. And the express license is non-negotiable. You write in the name of the company, and the only negotiation is over the due diligence milestones that the company will have to meet. All the legal terms and all the financial terms are specified. Now, you can imagine the dynamic of the CEO and his general counsel looking at this license, and the general counsel saying, we got to change this, we got to change this. And the only way the CEO overrules him and says, nope, we're going to live with it, is if it is such a fabulous deal that he's prepared to take that legal risk that his or her general counsel has shown. And so this UNC express license has incredibly concessionary terms, minuscule royalties, no milestone payments, no equity. It's only for UNC startups. There is an exit fee in lieu of an equity. I think it has accelerated their flow of startups, but other universities have looked at that and said no. Now, Baldwin's University, Columbia, has a different approach. They have said there is a one-size-fits-all model for the equity distribution in a new university spin-out, but then we need to come up with technology-specific other financial terms, and there is a process for that to accelerate it. So that is one model towards standardization, and I think the Columbia model is going to have more widespread acceptability.
And to kind of add to that, I've seen other initiatives, right? So NIH a while back did the IRMA experiment, right, where they were trying to do all of their biological materials licensing with an express license. It was like a nominal fee, a simple letter agreement, accept it or go away, right? And even so, I used to work in one of the NIH tech transfer offices. I'm not talking anything bad, but there were still constant requests for negotiating the provisions, right? So it could be completely acceptable terms, but what we found was the other side needed to justify that they reviewed the agreement, right? So there are lots of different initiatives that have gone on where there have been attempts to make licensing or startup formation more uniform, and all parties have to play. And if it's not acceptable, then it's just not going to work.
My general counsel at Dana-Farber once said to me, I never met an agreement I couldn't change, without in any way wishing to impugn attorneys.
Well, thank you again for this great panel. I'm an economist, and I've got 5 really smart lawyers in front of me. So my question is not about Bayh-Dole as much as the ability of the law or statute to provide some relief from high drug prices. But I'll come back to the Bayh-Dole Act because there were a couple of phrases that, John, you read out, which I found really helpful. You know, one was this concept of reasonable terms. Someone is going to have to define it. And I was wondering what the panel's thoughts were on how the courts would actually define reasonable price. Would it be some kind of cost effectiveness? Would it be affordability? A drug could be cost effective but still completely unaffordable to lots of people. That made me wonder about the word the public. Is the public payer? Is the public the average American who's earning $50,000 a year? Is it someone who's enrolled in a United Healthcare plan? And then finally, what I was struggling with was, there are many reasons why we have high drug prices in America, but one of them is faulty plan design, where insurers essentially put people into high deductible health plans, or in Medicare Part D, we have the catastrophic. So people who need insulin are essentially paying the full price. And that has to do with the skimpiness or the stinginess of taxpayers or insurance companies. How does the presence of this intermediary, the insurer, show up in how I should interpret the Bayh-Dole Act? And this is not a question about is the act good or bad, it's just about if we were to implement it, wouldn't we run into some of these challenges, or is your expert opinion as a panel of 5 that no, if we were to implement it, those challenges are all kind of easy for courts to figure out?
I'll answer very briefly because time is short and we have another person in queue. Many patents are subject to so-called FRAND commitments, which is they have to be licensed on fair, reasonable, and non-discriminatory terms. That's typical for patents involved in a standard. There's been quite a bit of judicial ferment on what it means to license a patent under reasonable terms. I think that would be a great source of law here. What's the public? So far, the trend seems to think, what are people in other countries paying? Why do we have a drug that's developed with the U.S. taxpayer funds that's being sold for 1/3 the price in other jurisdictions? That's unacceptable to the U.S. taxpayer, and I think that's going to largely be a comparison of who is the public. Thanks.
Jay, discovered with, not developed with.
And I would just substitute agency for courts. I would not want the courts doing this. This is what I think NIST has the ability to do, were it to take the opposite view of reasonable terms. If it were to say that reasonable terms include pricing, it would have the ability then to think about all of those really complicated questions that one should never think about in the context of a one-off lawsuit, because that's not the way. The reason we've set up the administrative state is to deal with these complex economic questions. This is not what judges can do or should do, because I know judges and they're not economists.
So my question probably expands on what you just said, but is this discussion predicated on the assumption that the pricing renders the net health effect of all of these drugs negative? And is the burden of proof to show that there aren't individuals for whom the pricing is an impediment, or is the burden to show that the license has not resulted in improvements in public health care or health care? Because I think it's a real reach to argue that the high prices and the individuals who are obviously damaged or impaired by the high price of the drug, to focus on that alone and not the people who in fact are cured by their drugs, whether the burden of proof is that the burden of developing this for health is not the right burden, as opposed to the burden of making it essentially freely available to all or readily available to all. I just wonder what you think that burden would be. And I also call attention to the really complex role of tech transfer. If you go back to the long history of Endless Frontier, it's, government invests in basic research. I believe the phrase is to overcome the drudgery of human life is the phrase in the document. If you lived in Ohio, it made a big difference if you were going to start the company in Ohio, because creating jobs was seen as a premium during the Edison project. Similar programs exist in Texas, in Michigan, and places like that. And at what point is it fair to pick on a single attribute of the output of tech transfer as opposed to the big picture?
When I was at university, I was taught the magic of price. It sets supply and demand perfectly, and we don't have to do anything at all. But of course, in this market, people using are not the people buying, or not the people paying for it. So there certainly have been proposals to measure the value of the drug based on its marginal therapeutic improvement. Again, I don't think that's the way this is going to go. I think the way it would go is comparing prices in the United States vis-a-vis those of other nations.
Well, you do have bodies like NICE. In the UK, you have ICER in Boston, which are attempting to put a value on drugs. So a methodology is evolving there, I think, that perhaps wasn't there 10 years ago, probably even 5 years ago. And, their opinions, and you can see with the PCSK9 inhibitors, Amgen and Sanofi have, in fact, reduced their prices to about what ICER said the drugs were worth.
We have time for one more question.
I'll try to make this very brief. If you on the panel have a personal perspective that, the last question notwithstanding, that there is a real problem with the affordability of drugs for the Americans, and you are going to be in this space as one critical piece to make a difference, do any of you have a recommendation that you would want that come out of this proceedings that would be curative, that would be impactful? Can we get from you a recommendation if you in fact believe that there is a problem and that this area is germane to that problem?
I'm sitting on your left, so I'm going to say price controls.
So if you don't mind, I'm going to ask you a question in response to your question, which is, are we talking about publicly funded research, or are we talking about price across the board for all drugs?
Given that we've got John's point, in this case now let's narrow it down to public funded research. It's NIH, technology transfer from NIH money, whether intramural or extramural, moving towards industry, and then on to the price for the American people. Is there a problem in this space that needs to be dealt with?
And I'll say, just speaking for myself, I don't think it's unique to publicly funded research. I think that it's a bigger problem.
In this space of publicly funded research, is there a problem here? And is there something in this patent conversation that needs to be addressed in this space under these narrow constraints?
So I'll also throw out Cronyism, lack of true publicly available licensing between contractors and potential developers. We at Georgetown, just go with the last person we went with last time, very little accounting and the lack of information about the public's enormous investment in innovation.
Thank you for the chance.
Please join me in thanking this excellent panel.